everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Bloom, where we will be unpacking the relationship between student wellbeing and learning outcomes. Before we begin, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters across Australia and pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is James Holder from Bloom, and Dr Lynn O'Grady, community psychologist, is our special guest today. Today's webinar is intended to support educators with their understanding of how a student's wellbeing is interconnected with their learning outcomes. I believe all Australian educators would agree there is a direct connection between these domains. However, it is important we take a more holistic view at the factors that impact the student experience at school and their sense of belonging. The team at Bloom regularly see correlation between learning and wellbeing visualised through our platform. We know with complete certainty that a student is able to learn at their optimum when they are at their happiest, and the information Bloom provides supports this. That being said, how do we become more mindful around the factors that contribute to the student experience at school? To answer this question, I would now like to introduce Dr. Lynn O'Grady. Lynn is a community psychologist and has extensive experience working with the health and education sectors, in addition to helping manage the Kids Matter project for the Australian Psychological Society. Lynn is also the author of a book called Keeping Our Kids Alive, Parenting a Suicidal Young Person, where Lynn explains exactly what it means to be a parent of a teenager who is struggling with suicidal thoughts and how to help. Over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, James, and it's great to be here with you. Looking forward to having a conversation with you today. I guess belonging is something that we've been hearing about quite a bit recently, but it's probably good for us to look back and to think about the history and recognise that even back in the 1960s, which is a pretty long time ago now, belonging was starting to be recognised as a human need. So people might be familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and belonging is one of those needs. And then as we moved into the 1980s, in terms of psychology, psychological sense of community started to be recognised, and that was an area of particular interest for me when I was looking at my doctoral thesis, actually. And then we moved into the 1990s, where the sense of belonging and the connection with school started to really come into its own. So there was certainly quite a bit of research that was coming out in 1993, I think, was when the term was really coined and really looked at in terms of what it means for schools and the important role that schools played and the importance of a school being a place where students felt like they belong. And then engagement started to be the language. So over time, different language starts to come into play. So engagement started in the 2000s, thinking about engagement in terms of behaviour, in terms of academic interest and engagement, and emotional engagement in school settings. So you see the research that sort of keeps continuing and building on that original work and linking back sometimes to previous research. And so looking at the links between mental health, engagement, attendance, academic performance continued into the 2010s. And now here we are after COVID, looking at the hybrid learning and the challenges and the opportunities. So COVID, amongst many learnings and many challenges and opportunities perhaps, helped us to really understand the importance of belonging. Because when you are doing hybrid learning or you're learning at home and not actually able to participate in and attend school, well then you start to see what that actually means. How do you actually create a sense of belonging when you're not actually in the physical space that school provides? So there's lots more for us to be learning as we continue this continuum, I guess, or this timeline into the future. So when we think about students, it's pretty easy, I suppose, to think, well, everybody goes to school, or mostly everybody. We've all been to school ourselves, so it's kind of easy just to think, well, students go to school and the staff are there and the parents make sure that the kids have what they need and go to school. But the school context and the student experience is much more than that. So the student certainly turns up to school, and to get there, they've got the parents and family that bring messages and expectations and support them to get to the school setting. And then within the school setting, you have a range of school staff. And obviously primary schools and secondary schools are set up quite differently. And even within secondary schools, there are different setups and different arrangements. So there's a lot going on in terms of relationships and lots of opportunities for this sense of belonging to develop, but also, I guess, challenges when things break down in any of those connections. So any of those relationships can have some challenges that come up from time to time. And so understanding that whole context and the relationships and the interplay between them is really important if we're thinking about a student within the context of a school setting. It's also important when we're thinking about children and young people to be looking at something like the Bronfenbrenner socioecological model, which was from the 1970s, so it's been around for a long time and still comes up and still is really useful, I think, for us to understand the child as an individual, or the young person as an individual, and then all these systems that play out. And it's a dynamic process, so the child or the young person might impact on the system as well as the system actually impacting on them. So we know that the family and school setting and peers are really important as those really close systems that impact on children and young people. But then we also have the broader communities and broader environment and social and cultural factors that come into play as well. So again, it's this student is there in the centre, but you've got all these dynamics that are playing out. You've got all these systems that are impacting in lots of different ways. And again, with COVID, we're starting to see some of those policy directions, some of the impact on communities, the pressures on families, pressures on schools and pressures on teachers that then come down and impact at that student level as well. So there's lots of information then that's happening, lots of things are going on in this dynamic school environment, and lots of information that can be gathered and is often gathered. But questions can be asked about what happens to that information. So working as a school psychologist and working now in private practice, I know that there's a lot of information that schools have, but it can take quite a bit of effort to get access to that information, or for that information to be used well. So I think from a school perspective, it's useful to be thinking about who's responsible for gathering information about the student, and we're talking about academic information, we're talking about perhaps socio-demographic information in terms of the family and needs of the families, strengths and capacities of the families, and then of course we've got the social and emotional development and wellbeing factors related to the student. So who's responsible for that? And if we think about all the different people in the school, there might be different people that are responsible for each of those areas. So how does that information come together? Does it come together? Who do parents talk to if they're concerned about their child? And this is something, again, from a private practice setting where I'm outside of the school and talking to parents if there are concerns about the child at school, and asking parents, do they know who to talk to? And obviously in a primary school, there's a classroom teacher. It's often much more obvious. But in secondary school settings, it can be really challenging for parents to know who they should contact, or who would they expect to be contacted by if there were some concerns. So what is the process for sharing relevant information in a timely manner? And really important, I think, the timely point there, because for children and young people, time is their development, really. And so if we're missing these opportunities, or information's not being shared in a timely way, people are not quite sure at what point or when they should or who should talk to parents about that, then time can go, and then we can have more difficult problems later on, or things can be taking off in directions that are not so helpful. Do all school staff know what to share? So do school staff have referral sort of processes or pathways in terms of who do they talk to, when do they talk to, what information gets shared with each other? What are the protocols around that is really, really important. And if it's being shared, what do people then do with that? What are the expectations around information that is shared? And then how can mental health professionals, like me, external to the school, reach into the school to discuss the student? What are the processes to do that in a way that's going to be efficient, that's going to be inclusive of the student as much as possible and of the parents, but is going to make it easier for us all to do our work and keep the student at the centre of our focus.
Thanks for that, Lynn. So tell me about what you've seen in terms of your experience in schools when teachers may be either withholding some of that information or don't have the right channels to disclose the information in a timely manner to parents, families, caregivers.
Yeah. So I think what can happen is that sometimes for the staff it can be difficult because they've got this information and they don't know what they should be doing with it. Sometimes they don't necessarily have a good relationship with the parents or know who the parent is or how to contact the parent, or they haven't necessarily met the parent before. So that can be a real challenge for the teacher or the school staff. And then of course for parents, they can feel like things are going okay until it's not. So, thinking that everything's going fine, and then suddenly you get an email or you get a phone call out of the blue, and out of context it can feel like for the parent, because they're suddenly hearing about something, and if it's been going on for a while, that can then create this friction. So you can have parents saying, well, why am I hearing about it now? Why didn't I hear about it before? Or I've had some concerns, but I didn't know what to do, or I didn't know who to contact. So the tension can build in that kind of situation if information's not sort of passed on in a timely way, when it can be kind of contained as well. So we know with children and young people, the earlier we catch something, the more options we have. Whereas if it's down the track and then people start to say, well, this happened and this happened and this happened, then it's like this child and young person is being seen as a person with more difficulties as well. So we haven't sort of taken off the opportunity to deal with it. And then of course people like me, an external mental health professional coming in, trying to piece it together, trying to work out what do we do now, it's also fairly frustrating. So I think if everyone knows about it and it hasn't been communicated, it's frustrating. Time, as I said before, is really important. So time has passed and we haven't really captured it at the time that we could. So timeliness is really important, and the ability to trust each other, know each other and be able to communicate is really important, I think, in a school setting.
And would you say, I mean, for everyone watching today, that if we aren't handling that information, I suppose, in the best way possible, we are contributing towards or enabling that pathway to crisis?
I think so, and I think sometimes that's what happens, that it does end up in a crisis perhaps before, people even really hearing about it, or it can escalate really quickly. So if you think about a young person thinking about themselves and seeing themselves and perhaps needing some help but not getting it, or parents feeling like they want to get some help and then it's not forthcoming, then crisis kind of emerges, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, now we've got to do something, and sometimes that'll be the young person withdrawing themselves from school, so not wanting to come to school because school isn't the right place or isn't feeling good for them, or the school saying, well, this behaviour is now out of hand and we have to take some action and do some suspensions or whatever. So it can escalate to that point. And often when I've worked in schools as a school psychologist as well, and sometimes being called in at a regional kind of level and coming in and piecing it together, you can see, well, actually sometimes parents have raised the concern way back here, or there were some flags along the way that weren't picked up, and then you're left with a student that's disengaged, doesn't feel like they belong, is feeling harmed, their mental health being affected by it, and you can kind of look at it and think, well, if only we'd sort of, psychologists had been involved earlier on, or if the school and parents had been talking to each other earlier on, well, then we perhaps could have prevented this from being so difficult.
Yeah, makes complete sense. Thanks, Lynn.
So there's a number of challenges in information gathering and using information well. So I guess relevant student information can often be scattered across different systems. So particularly in bigger schools or secondary schools, you may have information that's being held by different people. So there's different gatekeepers, if you like, of this information. So it might be scattered and not necessarily pulled together. So you may then miss opportunities for the connections to be made. So attendance might start to drop off and it might be connected to academic learning, but that might not actually be picked up because you've got somebody who's looking at attendance and then you've got other people who are looking at the academic records. So that is a real challenge, I think, if it's not actually being connected together. So schools can lack a central hub with differentiated access for staff. So who gets access to what information, who's looking for it, who has time for it, what roles do people play, and that some people might have a need for access to quite a bit of detailed information. And I'm thinking about mental health information and wellbeing information is often not accessible to everybody and wouldn't be appropriate for all details to be accessible to everybody, but to work out what information is perhaps useful, or what are some flags that we might want to have everybody having access to would be really important to be thinking about. Learning and wellbeing areas of the school have disjointed processes sometimes and might use different notations and might be lacking a shared system. So there might be different ways that this information is collated, there may be different ways that it's measured, maybe different language that's being used that doesn't necessarily connect it together. So it might not make it easy to look at how we can connect this information together. Delays can occur, so situations can escalate, students' needs might be identified at the crisis point if we're only setting our flags at that point, I guess, if we're waiting until there's problems, behaviour problems or attendance problems or real disconnect is starting to happen. And at that stage it's much harder to be backtracking and to build that engagement and trust again. Each staff member will have information that could be useful but might not know how to communicate that quickly and efficiently. And so they might know all of this and they might be really in tune with what's happening for a student, but might not have a place to put that, or might not know at what point should I raise that and what information should I be putting there? Should I be waiting until it's getting extreme, or should I be capturing it at a point where there's a change, for example? So often with children and young people's mental health, or adults as well really, we're looking at changes, and so some of those changes are subtle when our mental health is shifting or changing or concerns are arising. It can be subtle changes. So who's noticing that, and then what do they do with it is a really important thing to be thinking about. A lack of systematic approach to follow-up action points can be a problem as well. So again, it comes down to who has responsibility for that. So who is it that's actually going to be following up, and what action are we looking for? What is that trigger point? What is that flag that we're looking for and that's been agreed upon? And then what will actually happen after that, so that we do have some clear actions that everybody knows about and everyone can be confident about, because teachers and school staff really care about their students and really want to make sure that they're supporting them as best as they possibly can. But whose responsibility is it to actually follow through is a really important question. And there can also be inconsistent historical metrics to track the student journey in the school. So over time, we'll be seeing some ups and downs. We'd expect that there'd be some ups and downs in students' journey across the school. There might be times of some difficulties. There might be things happening at home. There might be issues with friends. There might be particular challenges in some of the academic learning that's happening. So we would expect that there will be some changes. So having a way of tracking that across time would be really helpful, but not necessarily something that's built into systems in schools at the moment.
So a quick follow-up question for you, Lynn. What advice would you have for teachers that do have quite a bit of information regarding their students, but they don't know where to start sharing it? So there isn't really a process or a procedure in place yet.
Yeah, this is where school systems need to support individual teachers, I guess. So ideally, this comes from the processes that are at the top from the school down in terms of what is the process for teachers to do that. Yeah. And I guess schools are pretty hierarchical places. So there would be the person that you report to as a teacher. There would be a coordinator if you're in a secondary school, different wellbeing person as well. Different people have that responsibility. So I think if you're a teacher and you've got this information and you really feel like it needs to go somewhere and you don't have a system, to take it to that next level is really important. And whether that means talking to a parent first, again, what's the process in the school? And really important that teachers feel confident in that work and knowing who to talk to and what they do with that information. And hopefully there would be some clear pathways, and over time, hopefully that's what will develop. But important not just to sit with that information and to really trust that sense that you know that child and you really want to be able to support them. So you don't want to let that information just sit there until it may get bigger and then you wish you'd reported it earlier or you'd talked to someone earlier.
Yep, absolutely. That's great, Lynn. And we also spoke about the information that teachers are gathering. What about student voice? So how does student voice fit into this picture? How important is it to enable that student voice in your school? Yeah,
really, really important. When we think about student voice, it comes in and out of favour in terms of project type work. When I think about student voice projects, I think about student action teams, or for a period of time there's some student work that happens, and there's been different times when that comes in and out, or there's different, there might be student representative councils or people like that where you have a representative group of students who then represent the others and come up with ideas, and sometimes those ideas get lost, sometimes they might be followed forward. So I think student voice is really, really important, but often not done as well or consistently or deeply enough. So when we're thinking about all this information that's been gathered, it's very much from an adult perspective. So it's the marks, it's the attitude that the adults are seeing, it's about the behaviours or records that the school has. So it's very much adult centric. So to be thinking about how would we actually be asking students, or how do we bring actual individual student voice in about how they're finding about school is really important. So sometimes there will be the surveys. So schools would often have their annual surveys, but annual surveys is probably not enough, because we know that there's a lot going on in a school year, that the annual survey is one point in time snapshot that really doesn't capture enough information of the ups and downs that will be happening. So finding ways for staff to be able to add to the information that they're already gathering with the student voice in there would be really good. And I'm sure there's opportunities, and I'm sure there are ways that people are doing it, but it's probably not very formalised, or it might not be consistent across the whole school community.
And this is where I lean into one of Bloom's strengths, is our ability to increase that student voice, so capturing that general wellbeing sentiment from the students, relaying that back to the teachers, giving them the opportunity to really express how they're feeling and how they're engaged in their learning. So it's a real opportunity to get a holistic view of their overall wellbeing. So thanks for that, Lynn.
So if we think about all the factors that contribute to the student experience at school, there's many different factors that we need to perhaps be thinking about. This can be the students' past experiences. So even though they're at a point in time they're here and they're presenting in a particular way, they will have seen themselves as a learner and a school community member for a really long time. So if they've been at school, in primary school, they've been at school for a few years, they've had many of these past experiences that define them in terms of their identity and in terms of how they see themselves, so that they then bring into their role and their place at school. And often that's not necessarily recognised, it's not necessarily known, and sometimes adults don't even realise how students might be seeing themselves. The enjoyment, academic learning, their confidence as a learner is another factor in here, and we'd like to think that students all enjoy learning and feel confident, but we know that for some students that's really very difficult, and confidence can be really challenging for students, and not all students are able to learn as easily as others. So really important that we try to bring out the strengths and bring out that enjoyment in ways that are tailored to individuals as well. And that ties into their perceptions then about their academic ability. And we certainly see perfectionism as one of the real issues that I see sometimes in my work, as well as learned helplessness, where just this giving up, that it's just too difficult, and over time of trying to take risks and trying to learn, that it becomes very, very difficult. And so this kind of tendency then just to rather than take a risk, to actually not try anymore. And learning does require us to take risks, so that ability to take risks, and that's risks in terms of how other people see you, risk in terms of how you see yourself. For learning to happen, that's really important. So that student perception and how they see themselves is really important. And sometimes even a student who, from an adult perspective, is doing really well, may not feel like they're doing very well. So it's not just the facts about how they're doing, it's about their perceptions about how they're doing, or how they think that their parents think they're doing as well. So it's quite complex. There's lots of layers to that as well. And that then ties into their self-worth, their sense of who they are, seeing themselves as a good person, seeing themselves as someone who can learn, who's got something to offer, and their identity and how they see themselves. So we only hear about this from listening to what students have to say. Experiencing the school as a welcoming environment where they feel safe and secure is a really important one, and it seems pretty obvious and pretty simple, but I think it's worth thinking about from a school perspective in terms of how do students experience their school, the schoolyard, the school buildings, the signage, all sorts of things that contribute to how they may feel that they belong, that it's a safe, secure place. Sometimes schools do surveys and ask students to map where they feel safe, where they feel less safe in a school, in the buildings or in the actual schoolyard, and that can be really important just to get that perspective from the students. Seeing school as a rich environment beyond academic learning only. So we know that children and young people need to develop a whole lot of different skills and a whole lot of different strengths, that they have opportunities to show those strengths and develop those strengths, and that can be beyond academic learning. So school being a very rich environment that can see all of these different capacities that students have is really very important. Opportunities to participate, have a voice within the school, and that can look different depending on school settings. It can be the day-to-day interactions where teachers and school staff are asking what people think, having a say about that, and it can be right through to more formal opportunities as well. But the ongoing ways of including that student perspective is really, really important. And students often have fantastic ideas that adults don't even think about. So it can actually enrich everybody's school experience by asking students what they think. Students are already witnessing how adults communicate with each other, with other students and with parents. So this is the modelling that happens. When we think about where students learn their social emotional development, where does that come from? And witnessing and having adults that are modelling this on a day-to-day basis is really important. So how students feel at school can be really impacted by the way that they see adults talking to other people around the school community. And that's another factor that, again, students can be picking up on, can sometimes be concerned about, can sometimes feel comfortable with. So really looking at what sort of messages are being conveyed in the way that we communicate with each other. Expectations of family members is a really big one in terms of student experience at school. So students are coming with the voices of the family in mind, I guess, in terms of what it is that the family say about them, what the family members are saying about the school, the meaning of school, the importance of school. All of those expectations come to light, and that can be sometimes helpful messages, and sometimes it can be less helpful or less aware kind of messages perhaps. And then there are the expectations of the school staff as well, and that can tie into things like the values of the school, things like school mottos, the stories that people talk about the school and what it means to be a member of the school. And again, sometimes those expectations can be fabulous and really match with what the fit is for the student, but sometimes they can be a bit unrealistic or a bit nebulous, not necessarily very clear in terms of what does it actually mean for me part of this school. Peer relationships are obviously really important. We know for some year levels, thinking year 9, where peer relationships is what brings students to school. So that ability to fit in, that ability to come and enjoy being with friends and to be able to navigate all of those challenges as well is a really important part of the student experience at school. This ability to make and keep friends is something that we can really underestimate what that takes sometimes, and obviously for some students that's easier than for others. And with COVID, we're also realising how that practice is so important, and that support from adults to facilitate that, particularly in the earlier years of primary school, but not just in those years. If we think about secondary school even, it can be incredibly complex, and so adults supporting that can be really important as well. And again, the modelling that ties into the modelling of how we all speak to each other and what we all expect in terms of showing respect, and but also that ability to understand each other and be part of this school community. And then, of course, we have mental health issues that can be an important part of the student experience as well. So we're hearing all the time about anxiety, depression, ADHD, neurodiversity is something else that we need to be thinking about, LGBTQIA+, something else for us to be really mindful of in terms of what that means for a student being part of a school community. What are the messages that people are getting about them and their identity and who they are and how welcome they are at the school, and what people are thinking about them, what people are really going to be including them in, how they feel about themselves, and the school being that welcoming place where they can feel very comfortable to be themselves as they're working out who they are and how they want to be as a young person. And then there are also worries from home. So sometimes students are coming to school with a lot of worries about what's happening at home. And sometimes school attendance can be connected to that as well, where students are pretty worried and prefer to be at home or distracted because they're wondering what's happening at home. So you can see that there's many factors that come together that students can be carrying with them, if you like. And some of those are very positive and helpful, and some of them can be really challenging for them and be a bit of a weight in terms of them coming and then expected to learn and get along with everybody when there's all of this going on for them.
Now, Lynn, just looking back at those factors, that is a huge amount of information for a teacher.
Yes.
Year 9 classes, day 1, term 1, having to learn all of that about their students. Now, I'm going to refer to something we experienced quite a bit with Bloom. Now, Bloom's platform allows a teacher to have a really clear idea of the student as a learner through evidence, as well as a learner in terms of their own self-perception and their general state of well-being. How does having access to so much information about their students help a teacher as they lead into that first term of the year with a fresh cohort of students?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of students as well. If you think about it from the secondary school perspective, it's a lot of students. So having some information as a starting point would be really important, because then your focus is on building that relationship with that young person. So that's where that sense of belonging, that feeling welcome, feeling safe at the school comes from, that ability to feel like you've got a connection with this person. So obviously if that teacher has some information about you, it's a head start. And so it's then you move into just that day-to-day relationship building, and that young person feeling like people know me, people care about me, I matter at this school, and people have taken that effort, or people are getting to know me in this way that makes it safe for me and helping me to feel like I then then want to put forward and build that relationship as well.
Amazing, thank you.
Schools will be very familiar with a tiered approach to mental health and wellbeing, and also in terms of learning as well. So this is a model that comes from an article from UK actually after COVID, and it just picks up on this tiered approach. And you've got the universal approach, and then you've got your targeted area in the middle, and then you've got your more sort of wraparound, more clinical sort of treatment focus at the top. So the idea, of course, is that the universal work at the bottom is to focus on everybody. So all students would be getting access to this kind of support, whatever that's going to look like in terms of wellbeing. And it might be social emotional learning programs, it might be activities that happen at the whole school level. And the argument that these authors talk about is that needs to kind of increase. So all students will need to have quite a lot of that support after COVID and having had time away. There might be a need to go back over some of that earlier learning, or there might be a need for all students to have some additional support. So that's a really important part of the work according to these people writing this article. And then there'll be some students that will need a bit extra support than that, and that's where you then have the targeted care, and that might be where you start to think about what are the supports that we have and what can we do that might include small groups of students, or might be really looking at extra supports that some groups, year levels might need as well. And then what are the services or what are the resources that we can use to bring into that. And then the sort of top point there is really around your connections with community. So this is where you'd be looking at what extra supports we really do need that go beyond the school, that really look at the young person and their family and really connecting in and having really good partnerships with community agencies, with child and adolescent mental health services, whatever's in your community, and doing this work in this ongoing way so that schools have got this access and not, again, waiting until a crisis point, but being really aware of what's there and being able to support and work with families to be able to get that support to be put in place quite quickly. So schools play a really critical role in supporting families with their children's wellbeing as well as their learning, but really being targeted around where do we put our energies and what is a school responsibility is really important, and then what is it that the school is doing in collaboration with other people in the community.
Lynn, schools are looking to become more proactive than ever in terms of identifying students that need care. In terms of Bloom's able to help educators identify students that may have a very strong negative sentiment towards their own feeling of, valued or even feeling safe. Mm-hmm. So based on that, where would Bloom sit amongst those three tiers as a tool that could help provide more proactive care?
Yeah, well, I think the targeted, that middle range would be the one that you start to flag, and you're then able to prioritise and say, well, let's catch this. This is that point around not waiting until they're at that crisis point. So we're not going from universal, doing what we do for everyone, to then crisis for those students that need quite significant care. So I think you could really build that targeted centre part to actually be saying, well, here's our flags. This is what we know about our school community. Here's what we can be actually, targeting, and we can put the resources in there, and we'll know the students that are getting to that point. And so you're trying to capture that as early as you can. So you need to have good data to be able to do that. You need to be able to be capturing it and not waiting until suddenly everything's getting too difficult.
Absolutely, and have a really clear idea of what you're going to do with that data.
Yeah. So the authors who developed up that pyramid that we just had a look at, they talk about some strategies or some approaches in managing child and adolescent mental health and wellbeing. Again, this is post-COVID, so really taking into account what we've been through. And they talk about trauma-informed management, so we're really becoming more and more aware of the impact of trauma on children and young people, and trauma in many ways, from family, child abuse and neglect kind of trauma, but trauma that can be involved in lots of different aspects, single event traumas, all sorts of experiences. And schools, I think, are getting very adept at understanding trauma, so really understanding the way that we then communicate with students, the way that we form relationships, and having trauma-informed approach can help us to do that better. They also say that all may benefit from resources and support to restore resilience, so that's the point around the universal, so needing to do more work around resilience because COVID impacted all of us in different ways, but everybody's been impacted in COVID times, and so that idea around working universally to build resilience, when in the past we might have thought, well, that needs to happen more for some students than for others. But the authors are arguing that we need to do that much more for everybody. And then smaller group requires the additional support and guidance. So that's where that middle tier comes in. And then a smaller number again needs specialised treatment. So if you're really clear about what that looks like and knowing your school community, then you can really start to plan for that. And it might mean looking at what extra supports that we can get, what funding might be available, or who's in the community, psychologists or family support services, Headspace, who's out there that could actually support us with this as well. And then importantly, they talk about the need to support parents and caregivers. So encouraging consistency and sensitivity, knowing your community, knowing the parents, encouraging parental self-care. We know, again, from the COVID that parents have been through some pretty stressful times as well, as have school staff and all adults as well. So really encouraging to support parents and thinking about how do we do that. And then providing anticipatory guidance and suggested interventions to parents and caregivers, keeping in mind developmental stages. So really thinking about how do we engage parents in this process as well. And at each tier, what might that look like? So obviously the students that are needing more intensive support, you really do need to have parents involved in that. You do need to have parents that are engaged and giving permission for that level of support. But including parents at the universal level would be really a good thing to be doing as well. And then monitor the duration and severity of new symptoms. So again, having your information gathered in a way that allows you to do that means that you can pick up these symptoms and you can maybe decide, do we monitor it for a little while? Do we have some conversations? Do we gather this information in a way that helps us to make the connections between all these different aspects so that we're able to pick it up as quickly as possible?
Lynn, as we're working in the wellbeing space and trying to bring forward a lot more information to educators around student wellbeing, we're seeing more apprehension, I suppose, from educators in terms of having those conversations. What advice would you have in terms of using this information to have a conversation with parents or caregivers, and then how much information is too much? Right, so educator can see quite a bit around what's influencing a student, and a parent could be a negative influence towards their engagement and learning. So how much do you share, and how do you have that conversation?
Yeah, I think it is often hard for teachers to think about having these difficult conversations with parents, and if you don't have a relationship already, then you're suddenly having a conversation about a problem. It's not getting off to a great start. So that's where that universal work is really important. So doing the work you can to build the connections with parents across the board so that everybody's getting that opportunity. And again, I know schools have different processes for doing that. At the start of the year, there might be different events or different ways of reaching out. So having that as your framework to start with is really important. And then having your evidence and being really clear about what that is means that you can talk to parents in a very factual way. So you're not just kind of doing it in a hesitant kind of way that I've got a bit of a worry. You're actually saying, here's our data, here's what we're noticing, and we're getting in front, we're getting here as early as we can. Again, it's much better to be talking earlier on. So you can say, look, we're really wanting to catch this, we're wanting to check out and make sure that you're aware of this. And that's really an important part of it, so that you're not waiting until things are really difficult. And that's more likely to have you confident then as a teacher to be able to say, here we are, we're getting on the front foot, we're here working together and keeping that student at the centre. So we're here all working together, we're all caring about this, and we want to be able to provide the support that we need. And then again, being clear about what that might look like from the school perspective, and then what it might look like in terms of other supports or other services in the community. So the better equipped the school is to do that, and the teacher being supported to know how to do that as well, and the clearer the pathway around that is going to be helpful, and that'll help teachers to feel more confident as well. Whether they are the person themselves, or whether there's a wellbeing person or year level coordinator or vice principal or whoever, to have that conversation. And again, what we know about what's happened in the past would be really important. So you might be a teacher and this is your first year of this contact with this student, this family, but the school has a record of these are the conversations that have happened in the past, this is how we've supported parents, these are the sorts of things that we know, and then get the support of the appropriate staff to then all come together and to reach out. That will also build the confidence of teachers to have the conversation, and parents to feel like they're clear about here's this team of people wanting to support us and our student. Yeah,
great. And I suppose that having that information and evidence, that should be empowering for whoever's going to be having that conversation. So that's really key.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of wellbeing interventions and ways that they connect in and support student learning. And so this is some research that ACER and Vic Health pulled together that I think is really useful. So one of the things that can happen in schools is that there's lots of interest in doing all sorts of interventions, and there might be temptations to bring different people in and do different things. But I think to be able to look at some research like this, to be able to say, well, what is it that is evidence-based? What is it that is going to actually do the best for our students is really important. And then if you're looking at short-term interventions, you're working out who's actually running it, what is it that we're aiming to do, what are we expecting the outcome to be, how does it fit with the curriculum? So we're already needing to do some of this, and we're talking about personal social capabilities being developed as part of the curriculum. And then how do these interventions connect into that, and how do we do them in a way that is manageable for staff, not just a whole lot of different things coming in, but connecting it into student learning as well. And even recording this, how do we have data around what interventions has each student been accessing, or what information is available about at what point these interventions should be available. So again, coming back to that tiered approach, what would be offered at the universal level, what would be offered to that smaller group that need extra support, and then what might it look like for students that are needing a lot more support as well. Who are the people that can support us with this, but really using the evidence base to look at what are the interventions that are going to give us the most benefit, and the resources being best used, and that will support student learning as well. So I guess what we've been talking about is how complex this relationship between wellbeing and learning is. The opportunities that schools have, I think, to really gather the information and really draw on that to understand it at that individual student level, but then also at year level and across the whole school community, and to really be able to do the best they can with the information that they have, including parents where possible, including the perspective of the student as well, and building everybody's confidence in this space to be able to work in the most evidence-based way possible.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for lending your expertise today. It's been extremely insightful.